Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I am John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. What moment in history has that statement ring most true? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. The Chinese anti-sparrow campaign that was part of the Four Pests campaign. From 1958 to 1960, people were asked to kill as many sparrows as possible so that there would be more grain for the masses because sparrows wouldn't eat so much before it was harvested. The problem was, sparrows were important for keeping locusts in check, so in the following years there were huge swarms of locusts that decimated grain crops. This was one of the reasons for the mass starvation in the years of the Great Leap Forward. A little niche, but Arthur Galston was a PhD student in 1943 who did his research on getting soybeans to germinate faster. He noted that at higher concentrations, the compound he discovered, TIBA, caused the soybeans to defoliate, i.e., it killed them. Fast forward to the 1960s, and the Department of Defense wants an herbicide to destroy mangroves in Vietnam. They dusted off Galston's research, noted the part about defoliation, contracted with DuPont and I think Monsanto to manufacture the stuff. Those contractors effed up the mixture by overcooking it with it introduced a comically awful compound, TCDD, and the DoD promptly sprayed it all over Southeast Asia. Arthur Galston never had any intention of unleashing what became known as Agent Orange. He was just trying to get soybeans to germinate a little faster, and he had to watch in horror as his Frankenstein was used in eco-warfare and gave countless people cancer. He ended up traveling to Vietnam at one point to see the ghosted mangroves firsthand. I could only imagine that feeling. Galston ended up teaching bioethics for decades. Eli Whitney wanted to decrease the demand for slavery in the late 18th century America with his invention of the cotton gin. He hoped that the efficiency of the machine would drive down labor and eventually lead to the end of slavery altogether. Instead, it revitalized slavery for another 70 years, leading right up to the Civil War. The Cobra Effect. In India, the British put a bounty on cobras to fight against deaths by snake bites. People started to raise them to sell. The British dropped the bounty, and the snake ranchers just let them go. More deaths by cobras than ever. Improving the octane levels in early gas, leading to major improvements in early automobiles, and moving countries away from horse-based transport with all the manure and animal abuse often tied to it. Except they used lead, the single biggest mistake in quite a while. The crime rate dropped around the time lead was prohibited in gas is pretty amazing. The environmentalists' movement against nuclear power without clean alternatives, leading to more coal and natural gas power plants. But strangely enough, lobotomies were intended to be an alternative to keeping people in asylums for the rest of their lives, as when it was invented, drug therapy wasn't quite there yet, and most therapy was a padded cell for the rest of your life. Of course, lobotomies didn't actually cure the mental illness. It mostly made the recipient quiet and docile enough to rot away in some side room for decades. This then became worse as it became more popular, being used to treat badly behaved children or easily excitable and hysteric-prone persons. Federally funded student loans in the U.S. They created a huge amount of money for colleges and a huge increase in demand for colleges. This led to catastrophic cost increases and a great deal of poor decision-making on the part of students. Prohibition. Alcoholism was a serious problem affecting the United States at the time, and it was indeed a gendered issue given the relationship between alcoholism and domestic violence. Of course, it just ended up leading to the growth of organized crime, violence, and, oddly enough, more alcoholism. France's condemnation of the Italian invasion of Bosnia. Contrary to what some may think, Italy and France had a decent relationship in the early 30s, and Mussolini wasn't always the biggest fan of Hitler. When Hitler first tried to annex Austria, Italy stood in his way. France and Italy had a sort of agreement that they didn't want Germany annexing Austria, even if the treaty already said it was illegal. France had spent the interwar period creating a ring of allies around Germany, and all seemed well, even with Hitler gaining power. That was until the Abyssinia crisis, in which, despite basically doing nothing, the League's condemnation isolated Italy. Feeling betrayed by France, as there had been some non-binding assurances by the former to his invasion, it led to Mussolini growing closer to Hitler. This, in turn, cracked the ring of alliances surrounding Germany right down the middle, as only a few years later, Hitler proceeded to annex Austria with Italian support. From there, one by one, France's ring collapsed entirely until it was left in one front war against Germany. Now, Hitler still could have been stopped, mostly by Britain actually supporting France and upholding the treaty from 36 to 38, but one of the first dominoes to fall, aka Austria, was a direct consequence of France alienating Italy. Fritz Haber, the inventor of a process for synthesizing ammonia, he pulled billions out of starvation by leading the way for modern industrial farming. His process was also used for synthesizing chlorine gas, which was used to kill millions. His wife committed suicide shortly after the first chlorine bombs started being used. When you think about World War I, it's also interesting to imagine that Tsar Nicholas and Wilhelm and the King of England were all first cousins from the same family, and we still had World War I. Anyway, I think about things myself. If I would contribute anything to this story, I might look back to recent history and say the Patriot Act after 9/11. They did that with the best intentions to kind of find terrorists. However, it's 2024, and the government is still using those powers to spy on us. Tsar Nicholas II mobilizing Russia's army in 1914. He did it reluctantly, as the insistence of his generals that they had to be ready to protect Serbia if Austria was attacked. He didn't want war with Germany, and was actively advocating as such in telegrams with Wilhelm II, even as his army was mobilizing. But by mobilizing at all, he forced Germany to mobilize, and Germany couldn't do that without sucker-punching Belgium on its way to France. Honestly, most of what started World War I was a whole bunch of people trying to do their best who couldn't overcome the inertia of imperial bureaucracy and entrenched military elites to stop the war. Margaret Thatcher privatizing much of the industry as it would encourage competition, which would lead to lower pricing. Only problem now is many of the CEOs and companies realize that everyone needs the essentials, and so they jacked up the pricing of goods and services and have created a cost of living crisis and worse living standards since World War II. This is probably going to be widely unpopular and put me on a list or two, but the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, or generally how colonialism ended as well. So many ridiculous borders drawn on a map with a ruler. At the time, getting involved with Vietnam, on the surface at least, seemed like a noble thing to do. Why not send a few troops to defend our ally South Vietnam and try to stop the spread of communism? 50,000 dead Americans, and like 1 million dead Vietnamese later, and Laos basically still is a walking booby trap today. Let's not do that again. I wouldn't say this about all of its supporters, but the Iraq War. Many humanitarian interventionists and liberals supported it in the early stages and were enthusiastic about the idea of transforming Iraq into a prosperous democracy. Tim Collins' famous speech sums up this mindset perfectly. Of course, that didn't happen, but it's a reminder that intellectuals are not immune to the fallacies of magical thinking. Rafael Caldera, ex-president of Venezuela, releasing Chavez from jail after his coup attempt a few decades ago, even worse, allowing him to run for president. At this point, it might be qualified as downright stupid in hindsight. Who would have thought that by releasing a socialist hero, you might have triggered a country's socio-economical collapse, one of the biggest and worst cases of embezzlement, and a migration crisis so big half of the world just can't keep up with so many illegal immigrants coming in or out. Not to mention not only one but two of the most incompetent dictators in the history of Venezuela, somehow passing the guy who triggered an economic crisis by blowing all of the country's coffers in hookers and blow. Oppenheimer creating the atomic bomb. For those who didn't watch the movie, Oppenheimer intended to use the bomb against the Nazis, but the project to create the bomb took too long, and they ended up using it to kill the Japanese. In Oppenheimer's view, the Japanese were already defeated, and using an atomic bomb was overkill. With the Nazis, he viewed them as a bigger and more dangerous threat to the world. He ended up being haunted by this throughout his life. Despite the sides, war is always a bitch, and the innocent are the ones who get effed over the most. The creation of the Suez and Panama Canal. The Suez Canal's building process went great. Panama's? Not so much. A lot of people died to disease, injury, generally horrible conditions. This was during the beginning, before it was even America's project, and was the French who were running it. And by the time it was completed by the Americans, World War I was kicking off. Ferdinand de Lepus was even imprisoned after his efforts due to apparent mismanagement of funds and lack of availability, and he was the one who built the Suez and started Panama. A lot of work that just didn't get appreciated. It's been overlooked and taken for granted today, but is genuinely one of the most important feats of mining, architecture, and trade route creation. Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, took on much personal risk to empower women with access to birth control and family planning information. After World War I, Sanger increasingly posited a societal need to limit births by those least able to afford children. The affluent and educated already limited their childbearing, while the poor and uneducated lacked access to contraception and information about birth control. However, her good intentions to help women have more control over when and how often got pregnant at times overlapped with some notions of eugenics. During the war in Afghanistan, the US paid farmers to destroy their poppy fields to help get it off the black market so the Taliban couldn't sell it to fund themselves and to keep it from getting eventually turned into heroin. On paper, sounds like a good idea. In reality, the farmers would just sell the part that got turned into drugs, then burn everything else and then profit a second time. The British had a similar problem in India with cobra bounties, which just resulted in people secretly breeding cobras to sell them to the British.